When her father died, Sabina Beissel's older sister inherited the family mansion. The Federal-style Beissel mansion on East Main Street in Lititz, Pennsylvania, $3.6 million. The 84-acre Lancaster County farmland, $1.8 million. The Vanguard portfolio her grandfather had built, $4.8 million. The Lewes beach house, the Mercedes wagon, the Steinway and the family silver together adding nearly $1 million more. All Sabina received was a 126-year-old Federal brick apothecary on a narrow lot at the west end of Main Street that her sister had been planning to sell to a Lancaster County developer for years. Marlena laughed at the apothecary the afternoon the will was read. To her it was a forgotten brick storefront on a quiet side of town, worth $215,000 on a generous day, less the cost of clearing the building. But what her sister did not know was that hidden beneath the marble compounding counter of that apothecary was something Sabina's grandmother had been protecting for 56 years, something that would surface a family promise carried in silence across 4 generations, something that would answer a question Sabina had carried since she was 12. And by the time she understood what the apothecary really held, she would realize that her father had given her the only share that mattered, and she would discover, in the months that followed, that what was inside the apothecary was priceless. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sabina Beissel was 19 years old the gray November afternoon the family attorney read her father's will. She sat at the far end of a long walnut conference table in a small wood-paneled law office on East Main Street in Lititz, Pennsylvania, wearing the only black dress she owned and a cream silk cotton turtleneck sweater she had inherited from her grandmother beneath a plum wool peacoat with brass closure buttons. Across the table sat her older sister, Marlena Beissel-Fletcher, 35, a Philadelphia interior designer who had driven up from Society Hill that morning in a charcoal Mercedes wagon, and beside Marlena sat her husband of 12 years, Tobias Fletcher, a Philadelphia hedge fund partner who had not stopped checking his Bloomberg terminal on his phone since he had sat down. Marlena had not spoken to Sabina since the funeral. The attorney, Mr. Lyman Bowler, was 71, the same age her father had been, and had been Reinhard Beissel's classmate at Linden Hall School in 1971. Mr. Bowler read the will in the slow, careful Pennsylvania Dutch voice of a man who had read 4,000 wills, and had learned a long time ago to let the document speak for itself. Nobody cried that afternoon. Sabina watched her sister's face as the attorney moved down the document. The East Main Street mansion, to Marlena. The Newport Road farmland, to Marlena. The Vanguard portfolio, $4.8 million at the November statement, to Marlena. The Lewes beach house, to Marlena. The Mercedes wagon, the Steinway, the family silver, to Marlena. To Marlena. To Marlena. Marlena's silver pen moved down a printed inventory in her lap. Tobias, who had finally looked up from the Bloomberg, was running his thumb down a calculator on his second phone. Marlena leaned back in her chair and smiled once, softly. Then Mr. Biller turned a page and read the small bequest to my daughter Sabina Wilhelmina Beissel. I leave the narrow lot at the west end of Main Street in Lititz, including the 1898 Federal brick apothecary building and all attached structures, built by my grandfather Anders Beissel in the spring of 1898, and all contents thereof. Mr. Biller paused. He let his reading glasses slip down his nose. He folded his hands. Marlena let out a single short laugh. He left her the shop, she said. Tobias tapped his Bloomberg phone face down on the table. The building was condemned by the borough in 2020. Net to her, maybe $150 after the lot's cleared. Marlena checked the gold watch at her wrist. Congratulations, B. You got the shop. Mr. Biller did not laugh. He held his gaze on Sabina over the brass rims of his reading glasses for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes Marlena did not see. A look like a man who had been waiting 12 years to see how this particular moment would land. He cleared his throat and worked through the remaining administrative paragraphs and the witness signature blocks. Sabina signed her acceptance. Marlena signed hers. The meeting was over in 35 minutes. What Marlena did not know, what nobody at that table except Mr. Lyman Biller knew, was that Sabina Beissel had been raised in that apothecary from the time she was 3 years old. Her grandmother, Wilhelmina Beissel, born Wilhelmina Spangenberg, and known her whole life as Mina, had taken her on every Saturday and every summer afternoon of her childhood, and had taught her the compounding apothecary trade hand by hand, exactly the way Mina herself had been taught at the same marble counter by her own father, Heinrich Spangenberg, and by Anders Beissel himself in his last years. The apothecary had been the only place in the whole Beissel holding where Sabina had ever felt completely at home. Marlena, who was 16 years older than Sabina, had been at the Linden Hall boarding school from the time Sabina was 3. Marlena had hated the smell of dried valerian root and tincture alcohol, and had stopped coming down to the apothecary after the age of 7. The apothecary had been her grandmother's domain. After Mina died, when Sabina was 13, the apothecary had been padlocked by her father and not opened by anyone again. Sabina's mother, Charlotte Beissel, had died of breast cancer the year Sabina was 12, after a 2-year fight that had emptied the East Main mansion of every sound except the hum of the medical equipment in the back conservatory. Her father, Reinhard Beissel, 71 at his death, had been a quiet, careful Lancaster County Yankee who had spoken to Sabina perhaps 400 words a year for the 7 years between her mother's death and his own. Most of those words had been about the weather and the boxwood gardens. Reinhard had not been cold. He had been broken twice over, first by Charlotte's death and again by his mother Mina's death 1 year later, and the second breaking had taken something out of him that he had never put back. Sabina had grown up between her father's silence and her grandmother's slow patient afternoons in the apothecary, and the silence and the apothecary had divided her childhood into 2 distinct halves, the half she endured and the half she lived. Mina Beissel had been the master compounding apothecary at the Beissel Apothecary on West Main Street in Lititz for 56 years, from 1962 when she took over the trade from her father Heinrich Spangenberg until her death in 2018. Mina had inherited the apothecary and the trade from a line that went back 4 generations to Anders Beissel, born 1869 in Lititz, to a Moravian Pietist family that had been in Lancaster County since 1756. Anders had apprenticed for 7 years under the master Moravian apothecary, brother Frederick Buhler, at the Bethlehem Apothecary on Church Street, then returned to Lititz in 1898 and opened his own brick storefront apothecary on the west end of Main Street in the spring of that year. He had laid the brick exterior himself from local Lancaster County kiln brick, framed the interior in red oak, and installed at the back wall a single 7-foot marble compounding counter, a slab of polished Vermont Danby marble 4 inches thick, hauled by rail from the Imperial Quarry in Dorset. The marble counter was the only one of its size still working in any Lancaster County apothecary. The first tincture Anders compounded on that marble was a 4-ounce bottle of yarrow and willow bark fever extract for the wife of the Lititz Moravian brother in October of 1898, and the apothecary had compounded remedies without missing a season from then until October of 2018. By 3, Sabina could carry a small glass beaker of distilled water across the compounding counter without spilling a single drop. Mina had taught her the herbs of the trade, the difference between Achillea millefolium, and yarrow, dried at 38 degrees for 40 days, antipyretic, settles a high fever in 3 hours, and Salix alba, white willow bark. Peeled in the 2nd week of June, the original aspirin source, eases the deep aches of rheumatic fever. The difference between Symphytum officinale, Homphry root, ground into a wound salve with beeswax, and Echinacea purpurea, Herpflower root, harvested in the 3rd year, immune support for the seasonal influenza. Mina taught her the Moravian Pietist categories: menstruum, the alcohol water, Mark the wet plant material left after the tincture was decanted. Macerate the slow cold pressed extraction. Decoction the gentle simmering extraction for the heavy compounds. Infusion the boiling water extraction for the delicate flowers and seeds. By 5, Sabina could measure a half dram of dried yarrow leaf on the antique brass apothecary balance Anders had bought from a Bethlehem instrument maker in 1898. By 8, Sabina was hand-grinding tinctures with the 7-pound white marble mortar, and pestle Anders had set on the marble counter in 1898. The slow patient circular grind. The pestle pressing the dried leaf 1/4 rotation per slow breath. Patience, Lieblingchen, Mina would say. Patience, the medicine does not come to your hand fast. Your hand goes to the medicine slow. 1/4 turn at a time. The plant is patient. So are you. The first bottle of finished tincture Sabina compounded entirely on her own, selected, harvested, dried, ground, weighed, macerated, decanted, bottled, sealed, was a 4-ounce amber glass bottle of echinacea root tincture for Mrs. Cornelia Brubaker's autumn cold of 2013, and Mina had handed Sabina the bottle on the counter and turned to the next preparation without a word. She had not needed words. Sabina had been 8 that autumn. Her mother was alive. She had glowed for a month. Mina taught her the failures, too. There was a thing she called the over-extracted tincture. It was a tincture that had been macerated for too long in the alcohol menstruum. The extract brilliant clear at the surface, the alcohol-to-plant proportion correct. But where the overlong maceration had stripped not only the medicinal compounds from the plant, but also the bitter astringent tannins that should have been left bound in the mark. Such a tincture would taste correct through the first month. By the 6th month, the over-extracted tannins would have produced a sharp astringent bite at the back of the palate that no amount of dilution could mask, and a 4-ounce bottle that should have lasted a customer 2 years would be poured into the drain by Christmas. If you macerate the plant too long, Lieblingchen, Mina said, holding up a 4-ounce test bottle on the counter, the tincture will taste correct for a month. By the 6th month, it will go bitter on the shelf, and your customer will pour it out, and she will never order another bottle from this counter again. Do you understand what we are losing? Sabina had nodded. She was 12 that summer. From that morning forward, she macerated the plant material at the slow, careful 14-day extraction Anders had set in 1898, and she never sent an over-extracted tincture out the door. Mina taught her to read the herb drawer cabinet with her fingertips. The herb drawer cabinet ran the full 32 feet of the apothecary's west wall, 380 hand-carved red oak drawers, each fronted with a small brass card holder, each card hand lettered in Anders's 1898 German Fraktur with the Latin botanical name above the common name. Walk the drawer cabinet with your fingers in the dark, Lieblingchen. Not with the lantern lit. Your fingertips. If a drawer pull feels worn smooth, that is a drawer my grandfather opened 100,000 times. The yarrow drawer, the willow bark drawer, the echinacea drawer, the comfrey drawer. If a drawer pull feels rough and unworn, that is a drawer he opened only on the rare day a young Lancaster County mother walked in with a child carrying a specific symptom. The goldenseal drawer, the slippery elm drawer, the black cohosh drawer. The cabinet remembers every remedy. Walk it. The cabinet will teach you the trade. By 13, Sabina could walk the cabinet in the dark in her bare feet with her fingertips brushing each brass card holder and call, with her eyes closed, which Materia Medica volume the drawer's plant was catalogued in. By 15, Sabina was compounding all the Beissel apothecary's standing customer tincture orders on her own, measuring on the brass apothecary balance, hand-grinding in the white marble mortar, macerating in the original 1898 amber glass storage jars, decanting through the cheesecloth and funnel, sealing the finished bottles with the small brass dropper cap press, and stamping each bottle with the small brass AB. Dispensing stamp Anders had cut into a brass blank in 1898. The trade had become her hands. It had not yet found the word trade in her mind. To her it was simply what one did, on Saturday mornings and summer afternoons, in a federal brick building on the west end of a Lancaster County town with one's grandmother. There were stories from the trade Mina would tell while her hands worked the marble counter. The story about Mr. Roger Krieger, the Lititz family physician who had walked down Main Street to the apothecary every Friday morning for 38 years to collect his standing weekly order of yarrow tincture and willow bark decoction for his elderly Moravian patients. Dr. Krieger had wept on the marble counter the morning of his retirement in 2007, when Mina handed him the last bottle of yarrow tincture he would carry out of the shop, not over the retirement, but over the slow disappearance of a Lancaster County medicine he had practiced his whole life. The story of an autumn in 1989 when a Romanian refugee herbalist named Mrs. Caterina Antonescu had walked down Main Street in late September asking work, and Mina had given her an autumn's wage and taught her the Moravian Materia Medica in 14 weeks. Mrs. Antonescu had gone on to become the head botanical consultant at Longwood Gardens for 22 years. There was the story Mina would always come back to, the winter of 1943 to 1944. The Second World War had pulled the entire American sulfanilamide and early penicillin pharmaceutical production into the military theater, and the small rural community of Lititz had been cut off from industrial antibiotic supply for 14 months. A sudden scarlet fever outbreak had swept through Lancaster County in the third week of December 1943. 124 children under the age of 11 across 31 Lancaster County family farms. The small Lancaster General Hospital, with no penicillin to give them, the Lancaster County physicians turning to the only herbal apothecary still working in the county. Anders Beissel had been 75 years old that December. He had opened the apothecary at 4:30 on the morning of the first hospital call from Dr. Octavian Krieger Sr., and had not closed it again for 93 days. He had compounded yarrow and willow bark fever tincture and comfrey elderflower respiratory syrup and goldenseal and mullein throat lozenges for 124 children at the bedside recommended Moravian Pietist remedy dosages. Dr. Krieger Sr. had carried the bottles by horse-drawn buggy through the deep snow to the 31 family farms across Lancaster County for the full 14 weeks of the outbreak. Not one of the 124 children fell beyond recovery. Not one died. The next spring, the Lancaster Intelligencer ran a front-page feature on April 14, 1944, with the headline, Anders Beissel's Apothecary Keeps 100 AND 24 Lancaster County Children Alive. Traditional Moravian Herbal Treatments Save Lives During Wartime Drug Shortage. Dr. Krieger Sr. walked down Main Street on the morning of April 16th to thank Anders in person. He stood for a long minute on the heart-pine floor without speaking, and then took Anders's hand and pressed a folded envelope into it. Inside the envelope had been 124 names. Inside the envelope had been the children of those 31 Lancaster County family farms. The envelope was a request the spoken words could not have asked. Sabina had heard this story many times. She had not understood, until much later, what Mina and Reinhardt had done with that envelope. Mina told her stories that were really lessons. Once, when Sabina was 10 and had asked why her grandmother bothered hand-compounding 4-ounce amber glass bottles of Moravian Pietist tinctures on a 100-year-old marble counter in 2015, when the CV's pharmacy 7 blocks east could fill the same prescription in 12 minutes, Mina had set down the cheesecloth funnel she was washing, turned to her, and said, "An industrial pill is a compound. Lieblingchen. A hand-compounded tincture is a memory. When a Lancaster County mother brings her sick child to this counter, and I hand her a 4-ounce bottle of yarrow tincture wrapped in brown paper, she is not buying a compound. She is buying the patience of a woman who stood at this marble counter and ground her child's medicine slowly in the mortar her grandfather laid here in 1898. There are families in this county who still want to know that someone they can name compounded the bottle they carry home. The bottles are for them. That is the trade. The bottles are how we pay back the mothers who still want to know whose hand made the medicine on their child's nightstand. Sabina had understood this without being able to say it. The tinctures were a memory. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever taken a remedy that you knew had been compounded entirely by a single human hand and felt the difference of it move through you? Mina died in October of 2018. In her own bed in the small caretaker's cottage attached to the rear of the apothecary, of a heart attack in her sleep at the age of 79. Sabina was 13. Reinhard Beissel had buried his mother in the Lititz Moravian cemetery on the south side of the church and had walked down Main Street to the apothecary the next morning and padlocked the front door himself. For 6 years the apothecary had stood untouched. Sabina had been told, gently but firmly, that the apothecary was closed. She had walked past it every season of her remaining childhood and looked at the padlocked Federal brick door and the dusty drawer cabinets visible through the wavy old front window and the marble counter fading behind the apothecary, and she had made herself a promise without yet having the words for it. The week of her father's funeral, Marlena had told her, in the front parlor of the East Main mansion, that the property would be listed for sale by spring, and that Sabina should plan on being out by April 1st. Marlena had not asked her where she planned to live. Sabina had not answered her. She had stood in the front parlor with her hands in the pockets of the plum-wool peacoat and watched her sister's charcoal Mercedes wagon roll down the long drive toward the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The Wednesday after the will reading, Sabina drove out West Main Street in her 1988 Chevy Caprice Classic wagon, the only thing she had bought entirely with her own money. Paid $1,650 in cash to a retired Lancaster County dairy farmer, outside bird in hand, and she parked at the curb in front of the apothecary. She had not been inside the apothecary in 6 years. She had only ever stood at the padlocked Federal brick door and looked at the heavy brass padlock and the small brass key her grandmother had hung on a leather thong above the door that Reinhardt had taken down the morning Mina was buried. She did not have the key. Mist, Lyman Buller had handed her the key in a small envelope after the will reading, sealed with red wax. She had brought the envelope home in her coat pocket. She had not broken the seal until that morning at her kitchen table, in the cold early light before the radiator turned over. She walked across the brick sidewalk in the cool November light and stood at the padlocked Federal brick door and breathed for a long minute. She fitted the small brass key to the heavy brass padlock and turned. The lock gave. She lifted it off the hasp and set it on the worn brick stoop. She pushed the red oak apothecary door open with the flat of her hand. The brass bell above the door jingled once in the cool, empty air. The door swung inward on its old wrought iron hinges with a soft scrape. The apothecary was still there. The single 7-foot Vermont Danby marble compounding counter at the back wall, polished smooth at the dead center by 126 years of compounding, sitting exactly where Anders had set it in 1898. The 380-drawer red oak herb cabinet, running the full 32 feet of the west wall, each brass card holder still legible in Anders's Fraktur, or Mina's English. The 7-pound white marble mortar and pestle on the counter. The antique brass apothecary balance in its glass case behind the counter. The original 1898 amber glass storage jars on the back shelves, each labeled in Mina's hand. The 1907 brass dropper cap press on its cast iron base. The wide plank heart pine floor running from the front door to the back wall, polished gold by a century of foot traffic. The smell at the door was old yarrow leaf and dried valerian root, and the faint sweet trace of beeswax sealing wax and tincture alcohol that had soaked into the red oak through 126 years of compounding. Sabina stepped inside and stood at the front of the heart pine floor for a long minute and breathed. She walked the length of the apothecary floor in her bare feet. Her boots and her socks she had left on the worn brick stoop outside. The heart pine was cool, and the cool ran up through her bare soles, and she felt, by old memory in her body, the warm spots and the cool spots, and the slight shallow grooves where Mina had stood for 56 years, and the deeper grooves where Heinrich had stood for 30 years before her, and the deepest worn spot of all the dead center of the marble compounding counter where Anders himself had stood to compound every Moravian Pietist remedy he ever made for 50 years. The pine remembered. A memory came back. Mina, the autumn Sabina, was 9, kneeling at the dead center of the marble compounding counter and laying her flat palm on the polished marble surface where the stone ran slightly darker than the rest by a hand's breadth. Your great-grandfather Anders was a careful man, Lieblingchen. When he set this counter in 1898, he cut a hidden compartment into the marble base beneath the dead center spot where he compounded every Moravian Pietist remedy he ever made. He told me about it the last week of his life in 1949. He said it was where the apothecary kept what could not be lost. I never lifted the marble. Sabina had been 9. She had forgotten the story for 10 years. She knelt at the dead center of the marble compounding counter. The polished marble slab ran flush with the wooden counterframe on either side, almost invisible against the grain, with a small brass finger ring set into one corner that her bare feet had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. She slipped her finger through the brass ring and lifted. The marble slab came up, heavy, 4 inches thick, the section perhaps 18 inches by 24. Beneath it was a stone-lined cavity about 3 feet deep and 2 feet across, set into the brick base of the counter. At the bottom of the cavity, in the back corner, sat a tin box the size of a brick, the lid stamped Anders, 1898. Beneath the tin box, taking up the rest of the cavity, was a wooden trapdoor 2 feet by 16 inches set into a chestnut frame, sealed at every seam with deep brown wax with the Beissel Moravian rose imprint. She lifted the tin box out first, two-handed, and set it on the polished marble counter in the gray November light. She lifted the lid. A heavy oilcloth bundle inside fell open across her hands to reveal 195 gold coins stacked in even rows, Liberty half-eagles and quarter-eagles, and a small handful of St. Gaudens double-eagles in better condition than any she had ever seen. The coin dealer in Lancaster would later weigh the lot at 23,400. Beneath the bundle, a small leather-bound notebook held Anders' original 1898 compounding schedules, every Moravian Pietist tincture and decoction and salve by harvest week, every maceration time by alcohol percentage and plant material, in his careful Bethlehem-Fraktur hand. Then, the leather-bound Apothecary Book, Mina's own ledger. Every prescription she had compounded from 1962 through 2018 recorded in 270 pages of tight slanted script. Beneath the ledger, an old sepia photograph showing Anders Beissel in 1898 in front of the just-finished apothecary. A brass apothecary balance in his hand. A young Heinrich Spangenberg standing beside him at the front door. Folded inside the photograph, she found a yellowed newspaper clipping she had not seen at first glance. The clipping was from the Lancaster Intelligencer, dated April 14, 1944. The headline read, Anders Beissel's apothecary keeps 100 AND 24 Lancaster County children alive. Traditional Moravian herbal treatments save lives during wartime drug shortage. And on top of everything, sealed with deep brown wax, a folded letter with Sabina's name across the front. Sabina broke the wax with her thumbnail. She sat down on the worn heart pine floor at the foot of the marble compounding counter in the gray November light from the wavy old front window and read the letter through. October 4th, 2018, Sabina. By the time you find this, I will be gone, and the apothecary will have stood quiet long enough that your father will have known to give it to you. My grandfather Anders set this money beneath the marble in 1898 because he did not trust any Lancaster County bank with his Moravian apothecary money. He told me about it the last week of his life in 1949 and made me promise not to lift the slab. I have kept the promise. The apothecary fed us through every year of my life and most of yours. Your sister will sell what she can. But this box she cannot sell, because she does not know it is here. The schedules are Anders's. The Apothecary Book is the record. Compound remedies again if it suits you, Liebling. The apothecary is yours. Wilhelmina Beissel, Master Compounding Apothecary, 4 October 2018. Sabina closed the letter into the inside pocket of the cream silk cotton turtleneck. She did not cry. She walked to the dead center of the marble compounding counter where Mina had hand-ground tinctures for 56 years, and laid her flat palm on the worn polished marble, and felt the 60 years of body warmth Mina had pressed into the stone, the slight shallow groove of the standing spot under her flat hand. The smell of dry yarrow leaf and tincture alcohol rising up from the counter into the cool air. The marble was cold, the groove was perfect. Into the gray November light over Main Street she said, quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Beissel. I will compound remedies again." She read the newspaper clipping again. The article described the 93-day Lancaster County scarlet fever response in detail. It listed every family by name. The Brubaker farm at Bird in Hand, the Krieger farm at Lititz, the Wagner farm at Mannheim, the Biller farm at Akron, the Henrich farm at New Holland, the Spangenberg farm at Ephrata. The article ended with a quote from Dr. Octavian Krieger Sr., "Whoever stood at the Beissel marble counter for 93 nights last winter saved 124 Lancaster County children. We will spend the rest of our lives wondering what we owe him, and we will spend the rest of our lives compounding his tinctures as long as our children still need medicine." Sabina read the clipping twice. She folded it slowly. She put it in the inside pocket of the turtleneck beside the letter. She turned back to the cavity. The wax-sealed wooden trapdoor beneath the tin box remained. She lifted it carefully out of the cavity and set it on the marble beside her, then looked back down. The trapdoor had not been the bottom of the cavity. The trapdoor had been a hatch. Below where the trapdoor had sat ran a narrow stone stair down into the dark, sealed off from the cavity above by the wooden hatch. The air rising up from the stair, cool and faintly sweet, with the smell of dried plant material and old paper. She studied the wax seals along the trapdoor's edge, 8 of them, each impressed with the Beissel Moravian rose, the wax brittle but unbroken. She lifted the brass oil lamp from its hook on the back wall and lit the wick. She descended the narrow stone stair two-handed against the wall. The subbasement opened at the bottom of 14 stone steps into a single low-ceiling stone room 12 feet by 20. The stone walls thick with the white bloom of cellar mold. The floor laid in worn Lancaster County bluestone. Along all 4 walls, on red oak shelves built into the stone, stood the Materia Medica. 47 hand-bound leather volumes spaced along the upper shelves, each volume titled in gold embossed Fraktur on the spine. The original 1741 Bethlehem Moravian Apothecary Formularies and Anders Beissel's complete 1898 to 1944 working Materia Medica copied out by hand. On the lower shelves stood 380 sealed glass specimen jars, each jar tagged at the neck with a small brass plate naming the plant variety and the harvest year in Anders's Fraktur. The last specimens dated October of 1944, the autumn after the scarlet fever response. The subbasement had not been opened for 80 years. Sabina stood at the bottom of the stair with the oil lamp in her hand and the amber light catching the 47 leather volumes, and the 380 specimen jars, and the gold embossed Fraktur on the spines. And she breathed. On a small red oak table at the center of the subbasement lay a single folded oilcloth bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay Anders's complete 1898 Pennsylvania Moravian Heritage Medicinal Plant Survey, 12 sheets of cotton drafting paper, hand-drawn and signed, showing the exact location of 187 heritage medicinal plant communities Anders had identified and mapped across Lancaster, Berks, Lebanon and Lehigh counties from 1893 through 1898. 187 plant locations, 96 of which had been thought lost to commercial agriculture and suburban development after 1960. every one of which was still standing somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania if you knew where to look. The map was the complete genetic register of pre-1900 Pennsylvania Moravian Pietist medicinal plants. Sabina held the 12 sheets for a long minute in the oil lamp light. She wrapped them carefully back into the oilcloth. She climbed the stone stair. She closed the trap door behind her. She sat on the heart pine floor at the foot of the marble counter and did not move for a long time. She drove the Caprice the next morning up East Main Street to the Beissel mansion. She unlocked the heavy front door with the key her father had given her the previous October. She crossed the empty front parlor and the empty dining room and the empty library, every room still smelling faintly of the camphor and lavender Charlotte had kept in the linen presses, and walked back to the small back study where her father had kept his desk for 45 years. The desk was a heavy walnut secretary her grandfather, Beaufort Beissel, had built in 1948. The drop-front writing leaf was down. Centered on the worn green leather surface lay a single sealed envelope, her name on the front in her father's slow, careful hand. She lifted the envelope. The flap was sealed with the same deep brown wax as Mina's letter and the subbasement trap door. Reinhardt had used the same wax stick. Sabina broke the wax with her thumbnail and read, "Sabina. If you are reading this, you have found the apothecary. And if you have found the apothecary, you have found the marble cavity. And if you have found the cavity, you have found the subbasement trapdoor. And if you have found the trapdoor, you have found the Materia Medica and the Heritage Plant Survey. The Smithsonian American History Museum has been looking for the Bethlehem Moravian Apothecary Archive for 60 years. They will pay you for the volumes. The plant survey is more important. The Cornell Botanic Gardens and the United States National Arboretum have been searching for Anders's 1898 heritage medicinal plant locations for 40 years. They will pay you almost nothing for the survey, because what is on the survey cannot be measured in money. Your grandmother and I sold 1 gold coin every winter for 47 years, anonymously through a Lancaster intermediary to private collectors. We used the funds to anonymously endow 47 full nursing school scholarships at the Lancaster General Hospital School of Nursing between 1972 and 2018, 1 scholarship a year. 1 for each of the 124 Lancaster County children Anders saved in the winter of 1943-1944. We did not tell your sister. Your mother knew. I have left you the apothecary because the apothecary is the only thing in this whole estate your grandmother would have wanted you to have. The Smithsonian curator is Dr. Adele Henrich, your grandmother's cousin's daughter. She is expecting your call. I am not a man of words. I am sorry I was not a man of more words for you. I have left you what was your grandmother's. Reinhardt Beissel, your father, September 12, 2024. Sabina sat for a long time at her father's walnut secretary in the late November afternoon light. Then she folded the letter into the inside pocket of the cream silk cotton turtleneck beside the first letter and the clipping. She closed the writing leaf. She drove back down Main Street to the apothecary and locked the red oak door behind her. She drove the Caprice the next Monday to the Lititz Federal Savings Bank on East Main Street with the tin box on the passenger seat. Mrs. Hester Wagner, a second cousin of her grandmother, the branch manager for 28 years, weighed the coins on the bank's brass scale, called the dealer in Lancaster, and confirmed 23,400. Sabina deposited 22,500 and walked back to the Caprice with 900 folded into the inside pocket of the turtleneck. Mrs. Wagner had not said anything when she saw the dealer's total. She had just looked at Sabina for a long moment over the brass scale and signed the receipt. She called Dr. Adele Henrich at the Smithsonian American History Museum the following Wednesday. Dr. Henrich drove up from Washington the next Saturday with a climate-controlled archive van and 3 assistant curators. They spent 8 hours in the subbasement cataloging the 47 leather volumes and 380 specimen jars. Dr. Henrich offered, on behalf of the Smithsonian, $7,800,000 for the complete Materia Medica archive, to be kept intact in perpetuity as the Beissel Moravian Pietist Pharmacy Collection, with Sabina named as the donor. The terms allowed Sabina to retain the original 1898 Anders compounding ledger in the Lititz apothecary for display. Sabina took Dr. Henrich's hand on it at the marble counter. The first Smithsonian check, when it cleared in February, paid for everything that came next. She called the Cornell Botanic Gardens the following Thursday. A senior botanist named Dr. Maren Spangenberg drove down from Ithaca the next Saturday with 4 graduate students and a survey case. They spent 10 hours in the apothecary photographing the 12 sheets of Anders's medicinal plant survey and then drove with Sabina in a convoy of 3 vehicles to each of the 187 map-marked locations across Lancaster, Berks, Lebanon, and Lehigh counties. 141 of the 187 heritage plant communities were still standing. The survey became the founding document of Cornell's expanded Pennsylvania Heritage Medicinal Plant Preservation Program. The first Cornell research grant, when it cleared in March, $1.2 million across 10 years, paid for the apothecary's first winter of operating costs. The first month was refitting the apothecary. The slate roof had taken 6 years of Lancaster County weather and was missing 18 slates. The wavy old front window needed reglazing. The 380-drawer herb cabinet needed light sanding and a careful ray finish with beeswax polish. The marble compounding counter needed cleaning and resealing. Sabina ordered 200 fresh slate roofing tiles from a quarry near Slate Run for $700. She found a retired Lancaster County herbalist named Mr. Nathaniel Brubaker, 81, who came down from his place on Lemon Street on a Wednesday and showed her how to reset the brass card holders without splitting the red oak. She reglazed the front window herself across 2 evenings. She polished the marble counter by hand in 3 coats of paste wax over a weekend. She lit the small Lancaster County parlor stove against the back wall and ran her first batch of yarrow tincture across the marble counter in late January just to feel the rhythm again. The tincture macerated clean. The caretaker's cottage attached to the rear of the apothecary became hers a piece at a time across that first winter. She brought down the folding bed from the East Main Mansion back bedroom before her sister's real estate agent could photograph it. She brought down a small 2-burner kerosene stove and set it on a galvanized table by the south-facing window. A barn sale outside Strasburg yielded a small kitchen table for $21. A thrift shop on Main Street yielded a wool quilt for $15. Mr. Nathaniel Brubaker came back that next Sunday with a small cast-iron parlor stove he had pulled out of his own back shed and installed it himself in the corner of the cottage, vented through the brick wall, and would not take pay. "Your grandmother compounded the yarrow for my father's last fever in 1996, he said. "Just bring me coffee." She lay awake that first night on the folding bed by the south-facing window, the slow, steady heat from the cast-iron stove. A church bell from the Lititz Moravian Church striking 11 across the empty town. The roof above her was hers, for the first time in her 19 years. Things found their places. The cream silk cotton turtleneck went on a peg above the kitchen table. Anders' empty tin box sat on the red oak shelf above the front door. The small brass AB dispensing stamp took its old position third tool from the left on the marble counter. A new apothecary book went on the kitchen table, and Sabina began entering her own preparations. January 28, 2025, first Beissel tincture of the new season. 4-ounce amber glass yarrow tincture. For Mrs. Cornelia Brubaker's seasonal influenza. $24. Mr. Nathaniel Brubaker came every Saturday morning. He drove down Main Street in a sand-colored 1968 Mercedes 220D he had owned for 56 years. He came up to the cottage with a thermos and a paper sack of his wife's ginger snaps. He took a cup at the kitchen table, set the ginger snaps on the counter, said, "Mina would have liked this," and drove home. In her second year, the Cornell Botanic Gardens expanded the Pennsylvania Heritage Medicinal Plant Preservation Program into a working compounding partnership with the Beissel Apothecary. They needed a single-source compounding operation to produce annual heritage tincture batches from the surveyed plant communities, 47 hand-compounded tincture lots per year. One for each of the 47 Lancaster General nursing scholars Mina and Reinhardt had quietly endowed. They named their terms at the marble counter a standing order of 47 hand-compounded heritage tinctures per year at $900 per lot for 10 years. Sabina took Dr. Spangenberg's hand on it. The first Cornell check when it cleared in March. Paid for her second winter at the apothecary. The commissions grew. Dr. Octavian Krieger III, great-grandson of the 1944 Lancaster County physician, drove down from Hershey in March of that first year with a jar of his wife's chow-chow relish and a story he had been carrying since he was a boy. Sabina made him coffee at the cottage kitchen table and listened. His great-grandfather had carried the yarrow tincture by horse-drawn buggy through the deep snow to the 31 Lancaster farms for the full 14 weeks of the 1944 outbreak. He had been one of the 47 Lancaster General nursing scholars Mina and Reinhardt had endowed in 1972, the first one. He left without ordering a tincture. He had only wanted to sit in the apothecary cottage one more time. He came back in November and ordered 6 4-ounce bottles of yarrow tincture for his retirement clinic patients. Mr. Lyman Bowler drove out one Saturday in April with the original 1898 hand-painted Beissel Apothecary, EST, 1898, Lititz PA sign that he had bought at Anders Beissel's estate sale in 1949 and had been keeping in his law office hallway for 75 years. He set it on the marble counter and refused even coffee. A Pennsylvania Heritage magazine ran a feature, and orders began arriving from across the mid-Atlantic until she raised her per-bottle price by $4 and was still booked 12 months out. By the second autumn, she had a habit of sitting on the brick stoop at the front of the apothecary in the last hour of daylight with a coffee mug warm in both hands. West Main Street had gone steel blue with October. The maples up the street turned the deep crimson of late October, the Lititz Moravian church spire gone smoke gray against the autumn sky. She thought of Mina, of Anders, whom she had never met but whose hand had compounded yarrow tincture at the same marble counter beneath her bare feet, of her father Reinhardt, whose decision in September of 2024 had handed her the only inheritance she had ever wanted, of the 124 Lancaster County children on the winter of 1944 sickbed, of the 47 Lancaster General nurses whose tuition Mina had quietly paid across 47 autumns, and of the long, unbroken row of hands on the marble counter that had finally come down to her own. That's the thing about the trade our grandmothers teach us to keep. We do not always know when we are 5 years old and weighing dried yarrow leaf on a brass apothecary balance with our small hand on our grandmother's hand that the weighing is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, dram by dram. And then, 6 years after the old woman dies, we lift a marble slab she would not lift and find what she has left for us, and we understand what she has been teaching us. She had been teaching us that a hand-compounded tincture is a memory the alcohol keeps to the plant. She had been teaching us that the trade is not the tincture. The trade is the patience. The trade is the hand that learned, the hand that teaches, and the hand that comes after. And sometimes the trade is also the hand that quietly endows 47 Lancaster General nursing scholarships across 47 Pennsylvania winters and never tells anyone whose hand it was. Her sister got the mansion. Her sister got the Newport Road farmland, and the Vanguard portfolio, and the Lewes beach house, and the Steinway, and the family silver. She got everything you could measure with money, and she laughed at the brick shop on the corner on the way out the door. What she did not get was the trade. What she did not get was the grandmother. What she did not get was the 124 Lancaster County children on the winter of 1944 sickbed. What she did not get was the 47 leather volumes in the subbasement. What she did not get was the hand that came after. Sabina Beissel was 19 years old, and her father had just died. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a crumbling old apothecary on a narrow lot at the west end of Main Street in Lititz, Pennsylvania. It was the best $1 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, has anyone in your family ever quietly carried a kindness like that? One nobody else knew about? We would love to read your stories. See you on the next Quiet Road.